All right, good morning. Can everyone hear okay? I've been tasked with giving an overview of social gaming in 20 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to talk about some of the things that I think are the most interesting about the space, kind of give an overview of some of the main areas where games are being developed and distributed, as well as talking about some of the main themes of monetization. And won't have time to talk about everything that's going on, obviously, but if you want to read about it every day, you should check out Inside Social Games or Inside Facebook. We cover this stuff on a daily basis. So first of all, when I first started Inside Social Games, everyone was like, what are social games? Is it just multiplayer games? Are they just casual games? And we could talk about definitions and so forth for a long time, but just for the sake of narrowing down what I'm going to talk about this morning, I've been generally thinking about social games as casual games that are designed to be played with your friends on social platforms. So that means Facebook games, MySpace games, games that you play with your friends through Facebook Connect on the iPhone, Twitter. There are a variety of other types of platforms where games are being developed with a lot of social features, but that's at least the area that I've been focused on over the last couple of years. So for those who haven't been first of all, who all is playing social games or Facebook games on a daily basis? Okay, so 40%. So the kind of the origin of social games in my experience, really, at least kind of in the phase of them that I've been talking about and covering, really started when Facebook opened the platform about 2 years ago, and opened the door for kind of new kinds of access to the social graph and access to personal data and friend data that hadn't been available before, simply because the data didn't exist in a cohesive place. There were kind of a variety of early types of games that were developed. How many of you have played vampires or zombies or any of those types of early games? So those were games that actually made a game out of spamming your friends and so forth, and growing on the social graph. And we've seen an increase in production value over the course of the last couple of years, but that was kind of the state of the art in the beginning and has inspired a lot of development since then. There are a lot of types of games. There are games like Friends for Sale, which is essentially a way of buying and selling your girlfriend, your wife, or your friends and so forth. It's a way of flirting with them or doing kind of other types of sending types of messages like that. There are games that have a charity theme that tell you if you cultivate your garden, you'll be able to donate $1 to the Wildlife Federation and so forth. There's actually recently there have been a lot of advancements in virtual worlds, things that are kind of slimmed down versions of The Sims, like Yoville and so forth, operating within Facebook, that actually have a lot of the same characteristics of those games, even though they exist within Facebook or have access to the social graph. They don't always take advantage of that data as much. And then there's just kind of the gamut of virtual pets, card games, trivia sorts games, and so forth. So in terms of the major platforms, I think that kind of the simplest way to explain a lot of what's happened over the last couple of years is to just talk about the platforms that these games have been developed on. Obviously, there are a lot of platforms that have existed before 2 years ago, and a lot of big things have been accomplished internationally before then, but for the sake of narrowing the talk, I'm going to talk about the ones that have been big in the US lately. So Facebook, how many of you guys were developing games or apps on Facebook in 2007? Okay, a couple. So there, as I mentioned, Facebook, I was talking to Mark Zuckerberg a couple of weeks ago, and he actually said that no one at Facebook thought games would be big when they opened the platform, that they just didn't have that type of DNA. They thought that they were creating a way for people to create really kind of deep utility, like educational applications or like recruiting and so forth. But it became clear about 3 months in that people like to play games with their friends on Facebook. And Facebook took an interesting approach to the way that they opened their platform. They really didn't create a lot of rules. They really kind of just allowed anything to happen, created a lot of channels for powerful viral distribution, and it wasn't until about a year later when people were complaining about getting spammed by their friends for the latest mob game or quiz game that they decided that it would be good to kind of control things. And they actually didn't put any rules in on monetization from the beginning either. So they really created this kind of Wild West type environment where a lot of companies have come in to provide third-party solutions, and we'll talk about that. Just in terms of scale, so there have been about 14,000 apps published in the directory today. 5,000 games are at least played by someone, and it kind of goes down logarithmically from there. There are 1,000 games with 1,000 players, 100 games with 100,000 players, 3 games with 10 million players. So there are a variety of companies that have been formed to build games in the space, many of whom will be speaking today, who have kind of led innovation, kind of applying a lot of other principles, but also innovating in the kind of the core types of social experiences that can happen when you have access to kind of this depth of authentic identity information, demographic, and personal data that can happen. And obviously there's been significant investment in the space for the last couple of years, somewhere around 60 million in the last 2 years if you include virtual worlds. So a couple of just tidbits that are really important to notice when thinking about Facebook. Most of Facebook users are actually not in the US. There are about 80 million users in Europe, 30 million in Asia, and there are actually a lot of offshore Facebook game development companies that you don't hear a lot about here in the States who are doing a good business, kind of either small shops doing one game or folks who are kind of applying best practices from other games in those markets to Facebook games. That being said, obviously things are still growing rapidly in North America. Up until about 2 months ago, Facebook was still growing by over 10% per month amongst US adults. These days it's growing at around 5% a month, which is kind of the slowest pace they've been growing at for the last couple of years. But things are still just doubling about every 6 months or so. In the US in particular, there have been a lot of middle-aged people who have joined and who have started playing games. Sorry, I guess that's a relative statement. Between September and, well, actually, I think between February and April, the number of users over 35 doubled on Facebook. I think about 7 million. So that's one thing that has happened over the course of the last 6 months, and so that's changed the types of games that are being developed as more people of different demographics are now playing a lot of Facebook games. Here's just a quick chart of what it looks like. So over half of players are now over 25. And as always, women outnumber men by about a 56 to 44 margin. One of the kind of biggest developments in the kind of social gaming ecosystem, and really the social app ecosystem over the last 6 months has been the creation of Facebook Connect. And how many people here are familiar with Facebook Connect? Okay, great. So Connect is essentially an API that allows developers to use Facebook data elsewhere, be that on websites, desktop applications, mobile applications. And for the first time is really allowing for this kind of identity, authentic identity and social context to be built into apps no matter where they live. And that's created a pretty big disruption in the space. It's created a lot of innovation. Even in the last 6 months, we've already seen a lot of pretty cool kind of first generation products being released. And it also allows for a lot of just sharing and publishing back into Facebook in a much more lower friction way. So just to give you a sense of the types of things that have been happening over the course of the last couple of months, here's an example of Playfish launching Pet Society on their own website, which is still connected to all of the same social graph data and still provides all of the same types of experiences as you would get inside Facebook.com, but allows Playfish to build the experience in a much more customized way that suits their users and allows them to do other things on the website that they couldn't do inside the Facebook environment. And that's a big deal. People have tried to do that in the past. Facebook actually tried to do it a few years ago, and they've had a variety of instances of this API which have been, have had their challenges, their beacon issues, or other issues in the past. But Connect has been really well received because of the way that it handles privacy. It's all governed by the same rules that Facebook sets up on the website, and so there's pretty high amount of trust in those APIs. Facebook actually released a package for the iPhone. So how many folks are building iPhone apps that use Facebook Connect? All right, well, at least a couple. So these are actually your Facebook friends being surfaced inside an iPhone application in iBowl, and it allows you to play games on the go while you're not at your desk, using this, connecting to the same type of experience, really bridging mobile and social in some interesting ways for the first time. And most recently, last week or 2 weeks ago, Facebook actually announced some interesting integrations with Microsoft and Nintendo, building Facebook Connect into consoles. So now when you're playing Tiger Woods golf, you can post your screenshots, your scores, or whatever to your Facebook by authenticating through Facebook using Xbox, and this is going to just allow for deeper kinds of integrations in the future. This was kind of like the first level of what I heard was a pretty complex deal. So in general, Facebook has been building a lot of the tools that have been kind of setting the stage for the industry, and through Connect, as well as Connect on other platforms, expect there to be just a lot more innovation as you all are doing over the next couple of years, and particularly on mobile and desktop and just devices that are off or outside of Facebook. I mean, that's where the majority of things will be happening in 2 years from now. So obviously, when you're talking about social platforms, MySpace is another really important platform to talk about. It doesn't get as much press these days, but it actually has just as many US users as Facebook does, and they actually monetize better, according to most game developers. So while the product may be a little bit slower in rolling out, and the viral channels may be a little bit more conservative in the way that MySpace has chosen to design them, developers are seeing better ARPUs on MySpace, kind of for a variety of reasons. It's just a good fit for a lot of the types. The demographic is just a good fit for the types of games that have become popular. One thing that I didn't mention about Facebook yet is that they're starting to test their own virtual currency kind of API, and MySpace is doing the same thing. Unfortunately, MySpace doesn't publish as much data about what's happening in real time on the platform, but there are thousands of games on MySpace as well, and most people who have built Facebook games have at least experimented with porting their games to MySpace, which opened about a year later. It's built on a different technical standard, but a lot of the same kind of design principles and thoughts that go into baking the viral loops and kind of the other ways of thinking about social game design into the game are very similar, and that in general has held across other platforms as well. High Five, as you guys know, recently actually completely restructured the whole company around social games, and is now really thinking about itself as a social games portal or platform. And High Five is the #1 social network globally in a bunch of countries in South America, Latin America, Asia, Eastern Europe, and so forth. And these days, what they're actually doing is just building out partnerships with payment companies and getting games onto the platform, and really trying to build a good digital goods business. So they're a really interesting example of a company that has really kind of entirely focused the farm on social games, and they're kind of an interesting example because they don't have access to the same types of advertising markets that Facebook and MySpace do, and so they're really focusing on transactions as early as they can, or as quickly as they can, excuse me. And finally, no talk about social games would be complete without talking about Twitter. How many of you guys have been spammed by your friends by Spy Master updates and so forth, things like that? It's kind of like Throwing Sheep revisited from 2 years ago. Now the stream is starting to get full of kind of like newsfeed updates from games, basically. Folks have basically applied a lot of the same types of RPG principles that led to the preponderance of mob-based and other theme-based RPGs that have largely been very text-oriented on social networks to Twitter as well. And it's still really early, and the initial social reaction is still being tested. But there are a bunch of folks who are trying to essentially take advantage of the viral properties of Twitter to help spread elements of the game, or help kind of use Twitter as a news feed for events that are happening in the game. There are also some interesting examples of payment happening through Twitter as well. It's still really early for all of that stuff. There are also a lot of other casual games like quizzes and typing games and so forth, seeing who can spam their Twitter feed the fastest and so forth. But they're really interesting kind of early examples of how a lot of the games that have been developed on Facebook and MySpace may or may not work in this environment. It really is a different kind of platform. It really has different kinds of connections. And so kind of the inherent motivations for following people and so forth is very different than the inherent kind of value created by friending people on social networks. And so I don't think we'll see the same types of games end up succeeding there as we have before. Just for the sake of providing a comprehensive overview, I'm not going to go into detail about these things, but there are a variety of companies which are essentially trying to provide some APIs for social games out of the box without having to build a lot of kind of reinvent the wheel several times over. So these are companies that are doing things like leaderboards, challenges, cross-platform chat, and they're really interesting, and lumping them all into one bucket doesn't do any of them justice. But essentially, there are companies that are creating APIs so that Flash game developers don't have to do all the plumbing to connect to all the social networks, and there may be some interesting things happening there. Although those are all still super early. Come to Play, J2Play, OpenFaint. You guys have probably heard of a lot of these companies. We talk about them on Inside Social Games all the time. Obviously, another huge realm that is where interesting things are happening are just ways that casual or Flash portals are building social features into their site. I'm not going to talk about them a lot today simply because they don't usually integrate with the social graph in the same way, and so don't have the same kind of identity-based experiences that happen on social networks. But obviously there's a lot happening there. And finally, just for the sake of mentioning it, Yahoo and Google have also basically adopted open social for their own platforms and have attempted to lure game developers to build apps for their platforms as well. And it's still not yet clear if sending game invites to your Yahoo contact list is the same as sending game invites to your friends on Facebook. It's not the same type of social context. It's very much an address book experience. And so, to my knowledge, there haven't been any games that have really taken off in this world, although kind of the root level, kind of the base level of distribution that you can get for just integrating your game on their iGoogle start page or something is pretty good. There are still tens of millions of uniques using these services every month. And the potential is there for Google and Yahoo to do some really interesting social things if they integrate their data kind of in the correct way. When Yahoo rolled out their platform a few months ago, they actually created a second level of relationship called a connection, which is different than a contact. And so before you could send an invite to any of your friends using a Yahoo game, a game on the Yahoo app platform, they had to first upgrade their account. So it really kind of hurt the viral growth of apps on the Yahoo platform. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how those guys decide to evolve what they're doing. So in general, I think that's a good kind of basic overview of kind of where a lot of games are being developed and where a lot of kind of growth is happening, both on kind of traffic and monetization. I'm going to also briefly, kind of before I conclude, talk about some of the earlier trends that we've seen on the monetization front, kind of the ways that companies are taking payments and the ways that users are paying, and some of the numbers that we've seen in general. As you guys know, most all of these games are freemium, free-to-play, user-pay games where hardcore users are paying through either web-based or mobile payment solutions to buy something for $1 or make impulse purchases and so forth to upgrade their character, upgrade their room, accelerate through the course of the game more quickly. And these types of purchases historically haven't been really well suited for credit cards for a variety of reasons. And so there's kind of a rich ecosystem that's been created over the last year to help, or last 2 years to help game developers monetize. And these guys will all be talking on a panel later today, talking about kind of some of the more specific things that are happening within each of their companies. But essentially, kind of the main category, and the one that is the fastest growing, and many game developers now report over 50% of their revenues are actually coming through user payments. So in the beginning, Facebook didn't actually do anything related to monetization on the platform. In fact, it wasn't until about like a month ago when they did their first alpha tests on the platform, and it's still a very small experiment, and a lot of people in this community criticize them for not making more money from apps earlier on, or trying to more directly help developers do that. But instead, they've said, hey, we're going to take a hands-off approach. We're going to let other folks come in, and we'll take a wait-and-see attitude towards things. And now they're starting to actually get involved. So companies like Spare Change and Social Gold have come in and created essentially third-party virtual currencies. How many of you guys have purchased a third-party virtual currency on Facebook? Oh, that's pretty good. These guys are essentially building out publisher networks and doing it that way. With Facebook credits, Facebook is itself becoming the kind of merchant of record, and is taking on the direct consumer relationship, and is charging a fee for doing currency reimbursements and things like that. And it'll be really interesting to see how much Facebook invests in its payments platform. Certainly something that I'm paying close attention to, and I know that everyone who's here who's invested in the platform is paying close attention to. So we'll see. They've been really conservative in the way that they've talked about it publicly so far. So I personally expect it to have a lot of success when they decide to roll it out more broadly, and it will be an interesting kind of dynamic as consumers are figuring out kind of which payment solutions they want to use. A huge part of the industry, obviously, that has been growing in the U.S. in particular, but also with international users is mobile. And Zong and Boku, which was recently formed through a couple of acquisitions last week, have been heavily focused on helping people pay through mobile. And those experiences are actually really quick as well. So kind of one of the main ways that apps have been monetizing outside of direct user payments, so for people who actually don't want to spend $1, is to do CPA-based offers, which have been really kind of instrumental in the early stages of this industry. For a lot of developers, offers represent 60–70% of revenues, and these are effectively incentivized virtual currency purchases. So players can sign up for Netflix and get 8 green bucks or whatever. It's more like 10 million green bucks. How many of you guys actually see a majority of your revenues coming from offers these days? That's actually a reasonable number. And this continues to be a really interesting space. It's really competitive. There's a lot of entrants coming in kind of on a monthly basis. And some of the players that have been around for a long time are actually doing many tens of millions of dollars kind of run rates on Facebook and MySpace, and oftentimes usually in casual MMOs on the web as well. But kind of providing the same types of experiences for game developers to monetize in that way. We've also seen some of the principles of the platforms themselves being applied in the social gaming world. So here you can see that Charles has sold Gillette on a virtual gift to send what is this, a body shave to your friend instead of a cute alien hamster for only 25,000 bucks instead of $1 million. And that has been a really high-performing way of advertising for a lot of advertisers, and usually advertisers are paying on a CPA basis on this front as well. But some folks are trying to charge on a CPM basis as well. So trying to measure the amplification of the message as those impressions are seen by others in the game. Fewer game developers actually have sales teams who are able to do this type of thing. So companies like AdNectar, Viximo, AppSavvy, these guys are helping game developers monetize through sponsored virtual goods. So in terms of numbers that people are seeing, comparing these kind of games to other channels, most developers that I talk to will generally say that if you're doing kind of a 30 to 40 cent kind of revenue per user per month in Facebook, that that's pretty good. There are a lot of businesses being built at that level. MySpace is actually higher, in some cases twice that. Most developers are seeing at least 50% higher numbers though on MySpace than they are on Facebook on a per user basis. And some of the top games are actually doing over $1 or $2. So these are actually really strong businesses. As I mentioned earlier, direct payments have actually been growing as a proportion of overall share of revenues. Some folks have been experiencing players kind of initially starting with offers and then moving up to direct payments as they get more comfortable with the game or the publisher. And that's something that I would expect to continue to see over the course of the next couple of years. Don't really have time to talk about virtual economies, but there's a lot of complexity in managing a virtual economy, and there are a lot of companies helping game developers do that. A lot of interesting retail theory is being applied to marketing products and marketing digital goods in kind of the most effective ways. So just to conclude here, actually one thing got cut off. So what's happening? There's a lot of free-to-play games being built on social networks. The social networks themselves and the platforms are starting to get involved with monetization now that they see that there's a couple $100 million business kind of in the industry here annually. And it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic evolves over the course of the next couple of years. Developers are really starting to optimize for monetization earlier in the development cycle compared to kind of years past, like in 2007 when games were really optimized for virality, like vampires or so forth. We've really seen a lot more effort be put into thinking about how this is going to work out, thinking about retention, engagement, and monetization earlier on in the development cycle, which has made for a lot of really successful small and medium-sized businesses, in addition to the big guys that are doing over $1 million a month on multiple titles. There are a lot of games that are bridging mobile and social experiences, as you've seen, SGN with Fluff Friends and I Fluff Friends, iBowl, and things like that. A variety of other types of games that are making it possible for players to bring their social graph with them wherever they go and have these new kinds of continuous experiences across platforms throughout the day. And one thing that actually didn't stay on the screen here was the kind of continuous question of IP that exists within the space. And there's kind of a lawsuit filed per week between companies that we'll be speaking later today as best practices are adapted between them kind of for the purposes of new games. And it's really a big question in the space. There are a lot of copycat games. There are a lot of really unclear IP questions, and no real standards of fairness have been kind of found yet. And so if anyone is interested in starting a kind of an industry association around that, feel free to chat with me afterwards. I think there's certainly some interesting questions there that should be looked into further. But currently, a very common strategy is to build copycat games and go from there. And so I expect we'll continue to see that over the course of the next couple of years until some of these cases get resolved in ways that make that less profitable. So with that, that's going to conclude my wrap-up this morning. You should subscribe to Inside Facebook and Inside Social Games for updates on the space on a daily basis. Feel free to grab me afterwards, and thank you so much.